A building stands at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, gleaming white under the Washington sun, its neoclassical columns reaching toward the sky like monuments to democracy itself. Every year, millions of tourists photograph it from behind iron fences, seeing in those limestone walls the very embodiment of American freedom and power. But here's what nobody tells you about the White House. Every single stone in its foundation, every brick in its walls, every architectural flourish that makes it one of the most recognizable buildings on Earth was placed there by hands that would never know freedom. The mansion that symbolizes liberty to the entire world was constructed almost entirely by enslaved human beings who were worked to exhaustion, compensated with nothing, and then erased so completely from history that we don't even know most of their names. What you're about to discover will fundamentally change how you see not just this building, but the entire architecture of American power. The revelation waiting at the end about what still lies hidden in the White House's structure will haunt you long after this story concludes. Stay with me, because I'm going to take you room by room, stone by stone, through the most famous house in America, and show you the blood-soaked truth behind every gilded door and marble floor. Most people think they know the White House. They've seen it in photographs, watched it in movies, perhaps even toured the public rooms, where velvet ropes keep visitors at a respectful distance from the furniture where history happened. It appears on television constantly, the backdrop for presidential addresses, the setting for state dinners captured by news cameras, the stage where American power performs itself for domestic and international audiences. The building is so familiar, so thoroughly documented and photographed and filmed, that it seems completely knowable, completely understood, a closed book with no mysteries remaining. But buildings lie. Architecture tells stories that its creators never intended, reveals truths that official histories desperately want to bury. And the White House, that gleaming neoclassical mansion sitting on 18 acres of prime Washington real estate, valued conservatively at over $500 million, is perhaps the most elaborate architectural lie ever constructed in limestone and sandstone. The building presents itself as a monument to democracy, but it was designed and built as a palace for an American aristocracy that the founders publicly rejected while privately creating. It claims to represent equality, but every dimension of its construction embedded and reinforced the most brutal hierarchies imaginable. It stands as a symbol of freedom, yet it was built almost entirely by people who were legally defined as property. The White House wasn't always white, and that detail matters far more than you might think. The story of why those walls needed to be painted, why that particular architectural choice was made, why the building's name itself references a coat of paint that covers what lies beneath, is a metaphor for everything this structure represents. Before we can understand what the White House is today, before we can walk through its rooms with any real comprehension, we need to go back to the very beginning, to a moment in 1791 when the site was nothing but swampland and forest. And the idea of a permanent capital city for the United States was just taking shape in the minds of men who would never live to see it completed. Let me take you back to Philadelphia in the summer of 1790, where the first Congress under the new Constitution was meeting and making the decisions that would shape the nation's future. The question of where to locate the permanent capital of the United States had become intensely political, dividing northern and southern states, commercial and agricultural interests, federalists who wanted a strong central government, and anti-federalists who feared it. New York had served as the temporary capital, then Philadelphia, but everyone understood these were temporary arrangements. The new nation needed a permanent seat of government, a capital city that would announce to the world that the United States was here to stay. The competing interests seemed irreconcilable. Northern states wanted the capital in the north, where it would be close to the commercial centers and would implicitly recognize the economic importance of trade and manufacturing. Southern states wanted it in the south, where it would be accessible to the plantation aristocracy that dominated Southern politics and would exist in a region where slavery was unquestioned and secure. The debate had deadlocked completely. threatening to prevent any decision at all, which would have left the federal government permanently itinerant, moving from city to city like some kind of governmental circus. The solution came through backroom dealing, the kind of political horse trading that has always been how American government actually functions, regardless of the noble rhetoric about democratic deliberation. Thomas Jefferson, serving as Secretary of State, arranged a dinner at his residence in New York in June 1790. The guests were James Madison, the brilliant political theorist from Virginia who had been instrumental in drafting the Constitution, and Alexander Hamilton, the Secretary of the Treasury from New York, who was pushing for the federal government to assume the war debts that states had accumulated during the Revolution. Over dinner and wine, they made a deal. The deal that would create Washington, D.C., and by extension, would lead to the construction of the White House. Hamilton desperately wanted the federal assumption of state debts, which would strengthen the national government and create financial ties that would bind the states together. But Southern states, which had largely paid off their war debts, opposed assumption because it would benefit Northern states that still owed money. Madison and Jefferson agreed to deliver enough Southern votes to pass Hamilton's assumption bill. In exchange, Hamilton agreed to support locating the permanent capital on the Potomac River, on the border between Maryland and Virginia, in the South. This was pure political calculation, with no high principle involved whatsoever. The location of America's capital city, the site where the White House would be built, was determined not by careful consideration of what would best serve the nation, but by a deal to get votes for a financial bill. The Residence Act was passed in July 1790, authorizing President George Washington to select a site somewhere along the Potomac River for a new federal district that would be 10 miles square, carved out of land donated by Maryland and Virginia. The district would be under the direct control of Congress rather than any state, creating a federal territory that would house the capital city. Washington selected a site that, not coincidentally, was very close to his own plantation at Mount Vernon. The location had several practical advantages. It was navigable by ocean-going ships, making it accessible for trade. It was roughly equidistant between the northern and southern extremes of the existing states, a symbolic compromise position. It was near the fall line of the Potomac, where the river dropped from the Piedmont to the coastal plain, a geographic feature that was economically important in an era when waterfalls powered mills. But the location also had significant disadvantages that would shape the character of Washington, D.C. and the White House for centuries to come. The land was swampy, malarial, nearly uninhabitable in the summer months, when heat and humidity made the region genuinely dangerous to human health. There was no existing city or town of any size, just a few scattered settlements and tobacco plantations. Everything would have to be built from scratch, which meant an enormous construction project using technologies and labor systems available in 1790. President Washington appointed 3 commissioners to oversee the development of the new capital, but he remained intimately involved in every major decision. Washington had no formal architectural training, but he had strong opinions about buildings and had been involved in designing and renovating Mount Vernon. He understood that the capital city and its major buildings would make a statement about the United States to the world, would announce whether this experiment in Republican government was a serious enterprise or a temporary aberration that would soon collapse back into monarchy or chaos. To design the city itself, Washington appointed Pierre-Charles L'Enfant, a French-born engineer and architect who had served in the Continental Army during the Revolution and had remained in America afterward. L'Enfant was trained in the grand European tradition of urban planning, with its emphasis on monumental buildings, wide boulevards radiating from central points, carefully planned sightlines and vistas, public squares and parks that would create spaces for civic life. He envisioned a capital city that would rival Paris and London, that would announce through its very layout that the United States was a major power deserving of respect. L'Enfant's plan for Washington, D.C., created in 1791, was extraordinarily ambitious for a nation that barely existed and had almost no money. The plan called for broad avenues up to 160 feet wide, far wider than any streets in existing American cities. It designated sites for major public buildings, for monuments and memorials, for parks and public squares. And crucially for our story, it identified two sites that would anchor the entire city's layout. The first was Jenkins Hill, which L'Enfant described as a pedestal waiting for a monument, where the Capitol building would be constructed to house Congress. The second was a site about 1.5 miles to the northwest, where the President's House would stand. These two buildings, the Capitol and the President's House, would be the physical embodiment of the two political branches of government, legislative and executive, and their locations would shape everything else about the city. A wide avenue, eventually named Pennsylvania Avenue, would connect them, creating a symbolic and physical link between the two centers of federal power. The city would radiate outward from these 2 points, with the buildings, locations determining the entire street grid, and the placement of every other structure. But L'Enfant's grand vision ran into immediate problems, the same problems that always confront ambitious plans when they meet the reality of limited resources and conflicting interests. L'Enfant was temperamental, difficult to work with, convinced of his own genius and unwilling to compromise on his vision. He feuded with the commissioners, refused to provide detailed plans when requested, and most fatally, ordered the demolition of a manor house that was being built by one of the wealthy landowners whose property had been incorporated into the federal district, claiming it interfered with his planned street layout. The landowner was Daniel Carroll, who was related to one of the commissioners and was politically well connected. When L'Enfant refused to apologize or compensate Carroll, Washington was forced to dismiss him in 1792, less than a year after appointing him. L'Enfant's dismissal left the capital city project in chaos, but his plan survived and would eventually be implemented, though it took over a century for the city to grow into the grand vision he had created. For our purposes, what matters is that the site for the President's House had been selected and surveyed, and now the building itself needed to be designed and constructed. This is where the story of the White House truly begins, in a competition announced in March 1792 to find an architect who could design a suitable residence for the President of the United States. The competition announced by the commissioners offered a prize of $500, a substantial sum in 1792 for the best design for the President's House. The building, according to the competition guidelines, should be made of brick with stone details, should have room for offices and ceremonial spaces, as well as private residential quarters, and should project dignity and Republican simplicity without the ostentation of European palaces. This last requirement was ideologically crucial. The United States had fought a revolution against monarchy, and the president was not a king. The President's House needed to be impressive enough to command respect, but not so palatial that it suggested monarchical pretensions. The competition attracted 9 entries, most of which have been lost to history. We know that Thomas Jefferson submitted a design anonymously under the initials AZ. Jefferson's design was based on Palladian principles, inspired by ancient Roman architecture, filtered through the Renaissance architect Andrea Palladio. Jefferson's design was elegant and classical, but also fairly modest in scale, reflecting his stated belief in Republican simplicity. It was not selected. The winning design came from James Hoban, an Irish-born architect, who had immigrated to the United States in the 1780s and established himself in Charleston, South Carolina, where he had designed several prominent buildings. Hoban's design for the President's House was larger and more imposing than Jefferson's, based loosely on Leinster House in Dublin, a grand Georgian mansion that housed the Duke of Leinster. Hoban adapted the design for American purposes, creating a 3-story structure with a symmetrical facade, a central entrance portico, large windows arranged in orderly rows, and classical details that evoked ancient Greek and Roman architecture. Washington approved Hoban's design, though he immediately began requesting modifications. Washington wanted the building larger than Hoban had proposed, wanted certain rooms expanded, wanted the stone to be a particular type. The final design that emerged from this collaborative process was a substantial modification of Hoban's original submission, incorporating Washington's preferences and practical requirements that emerged as the commissioners worked out the details of how the building would actually function. The design called for a building approximately 170 feet wide and 85 feet deep, with 3 full floors above a raised basement level. The basement, built partially below ground, would house kitchens, storage rooms, and workspaces for servants. The first floor, called the state floor, would contain the public and ceremonial rooms where the president would receive visitors, host dinners, and conduct official business. The second floor would be the private residential quarters for the president and his family. The third floor, tucked under the roof and illuminated by dormer windows, would house additional bedrooms and servants' quarters. The exterior would be faced with Aquia Creek sandstone, a type of stone quarried in Virginia that was relatively soft and easy to carve, but also somewhat porous and prone to weathering. The stone would be left in its natural gray-tan color, creating a building that was imposing but not ostentatious, elegant but not frivolous. The entrance on the north side, facing Pennsylvania Avenue, would feature a simple portico with columns supporting a pediment, creating a formal entrance suitable for receiving foreign diplomats and official visitors. The south side, facing the grounds and the Potomac River beyond, would be less formal, allowing the president's family access to the gardens. Inside, the plan called for a series of large public rooms on the state floor. The largest would be the East Room, occupying the entire eastern end of the building, designed for large receptions and public gatherings. West of the East Room would be smaller reception rooms and parlors where more intimate meetings could occur. The western end of the building would house the president's office and study. The grand staircase would rise from the entrance hall, providing access to the second-floor private quarters. This was the plan, carefully drawn on paper, presented to President Washington and the commissioners, approved and prepared for construction. But a plan is just a plan. Lines on paper, representing an idea of what might be built. The actual construction would require transforming raw materials into a physical structure, would require thousands of hours of labor, would require solving countless practical problems that the architects hadn't anticipated. And this is where the story becomes dark, where the beautiful architectural drawings give way to the ugly reality of how buildings actually get constructed in a society built on slavery. The cornerstone of the president's house was laid on October 13, 1792, with Masonic ceremony. President Washington attended, along with the commissioners, local dignitaries, and a crowd of onlookers who had come to witness the beginning of this grand project. The Masons performed their traditional cornerstone ritual, which involved testing the stone with square, level, and plumb to ensure it was properly placed, then anointing it with corn, wine, and oil representing prosperity, health, and peace. The ceremony was meant to be auspicious, to mark the beginning of something important and lasting. But even as the ceremony proceeded, even as Washington watched the cornerstone settle into place, the practical question of how to actually build this enormous structure was being worked out behind the scenes in ways that the official ceremony carefully avoided mentioning. The White House, as the building would eventually be called, would require an enormous amount of labor. The site needed to be excavated for the basement. Foundations needed to be dug and filled with stone. Sandstone blocks needed to be quarried, shaped, transported to the site, and laid in careful courses to create walls that would support the weight of 3 full stories. Timber needed to be cut, dressed, and assembled into floor joists and roof trusses. Bricks need to be made by the hundreds of thousands for interior walls and chimneys. Plaster needed to be mixed and applied to interior walls. Windows needed to be fabricated and installed. The work would take years and would require a workforce of hundreds. In 1792, America, particularly in the southern United States where Washington, D.C. was located, there was one primary source of labor for large construction projects: enslaved people. Slavery was legal in both Maryland and Virginia, the states that had donated land for the federal district. The plantation economy of the region was built entirely on enslaved labor. The idea that a major construction project would rely heavily on enslaved workers was so obvious, so completely unquestioned, that it barely required discussion. Of course, the president's house would be built by enslaved people. How else would you construct such a building? The commissioners responsible for overseeing construction began making arrangements to secure the necessary labor force. Some enslaved workers were hired directly from their owners through rental agreements. Slavery in this period involved not just the buying and selling of human beings as permanent property, but also a robust market in renting enslaved people for temporary work. A plantation owner, who had more enslaved workers than he needed for agricultural labor at certain times of year, could rent them out to construction projects, factories, or other enterprises, receiving payment for their labor while retaining ownership of the workers themselves. The rental agreements for enslaved workers on the president's house construction varied, but they typically involved the federal government paying the enslaved person's owner between $50 and $70 per year for each worker. This was decent money for the owner, enough to make renting out enslaved workers more profitable than using them for agricultural labor during the construction season. The enslaved workers themselves, of course, received nothing. They had no say in whether they would be rented out, no control over where they would work or under what conditions, no share whatsoever in the compensation paid for their labor. Other enslaved workers were provided by their owners as part of the compensation for land that had been purchased for the federal district. When the government negotiated with landowners for the property that would become Washington, D.C., some deals included the landowner providing enslaved labor for construction projects in addition to or instead of cash payment. This was economically rational for the landowner, who might have more enslaved workers than he could productively employ on his remaining land after selling acreage to the government. The workforce that assembled to build the president's house was mixed. And this is important to understand because later histories would sometimes try to minimize or obscure the role of enslaved labor by pointing out that free craftsmen also worked on the building. It's true that skilled European and American craftsmen, stonemasons from Scotland, carpenters from various states, plasterers and painters and glaziers, worked on the president's house and were paid wages for their specialized skills. But the bulk of the labor, the dangerous, exhausting, unskilled work that made up the majority of the hours required to construct the building, was performed by enslaved workers. The distinction between skilled and unskilled labor is crucial here. Skilled work included tasks like carving decorative stone details, installing complex joinery in wooden staircases, creating plaster moldings for ceilings, laying out the building to ensure walls were square and level. These tasks required years of training and experience, and workers who could perform them commanded premium wages. Skilled craftsmen on the president's house were paid between $1 and $3 per day, depending on their specialty. Excellent money in the 1790s. Unskilled labor included tasks like digging foundations, hauling materials, mixing mortar, carrying bricks, clearing debris, any work that required physical strength and endurance but not specialized training. This was the majority of the work required to construct any large building in the 1790s. For every hour a skilled stonemason spent carving a decorative capital for a column, dozens of hours were required for unskilled laborers to quarry the raw stone, transport it to the site, move it into position, and prepare it for the mason's chisel. The division between skilled and unskilled labor mapped almost perfectly onto the division between free and enslaved workers. Free white craftsmen did skilled work and were paid. Enslaved black workers did unskilled labor and were not paid. There were some exceptions. Some enslaved workers had been trained in skilled trades and worked as carpenters or blacksmiths, and a few free black laborers worked on the project. But the general pattern was clear and consistent. The racial and legal hierarchy of 1790s America was embedded in every aspect of how the president's house was constructed. The sandstone for the exterior walls came from quarries at Aquia Creek, Virginia, about 40 miles south of the construction site. The Aquia Creek quarries were government-owned, operated specifically to provide stone for federal buildings in the new capital. The quarrying operation employed both free and enslaved workers, but again, the division of labor was stark. Free white overseers and skilled stonecutters directed the work and performed specialized tasks. Enslaved black workers did the dangerous work of actually extracting the stone from the quarry face. Quarrying stone in the 1790s was brutal, dangerous work that killed and injured workers regularly. The process involved drilling holes in the stone using hand tools, filling those holes with water that would freeze in winter, and crack the stone along the desired break lines, or using black powder explosives to blast larger sections free. Once a section of stone was separated from the quarry face, it needed to be moved, often weighing hundreds or thousands of pounds, using only human and animal power with primitive mechanical assistance from pulleys and levers. Workers at Aquia Creek quarries worked from sunrise to sunset, taking breaks only for minimal meals. The work was physically exhausting, requiring constant heavy lifting and strenuous effort in all weather conditions. In summer, the heat was oppressive, with workers laboring under direct sun with inadequate water. In winter, the cold was dangerous, with workers expected to continue quarrying even when temperatures dropped below freezing. Workers were injured constantly by falling stone, by tools slipping, by explosives detonating prematurely, by the dozens of other hazards inherent in quarrying. When enslaved workers were injured at Aquia Creek, they received minimal medical care, usually just enough to determine whether they would recover enough to work again. If an injury was clearly fatal or permanently disabling, the worker was sent back to his owner, who would file a claim with the government for compensation for damaged property. The government would typically pay a portion of the enslaved worker's market value, which created a perverse incentive structure where owners had financial interest in the survival of their enslaved property, but only up to the point where the compensation for a dead or disabled worker exceeded the cost of continued care. Enslaved workers who died at Aquia Creek were buried in unmarked graves near the quarry. No records were kept of their names or how many died. They simply disappeared from the ledgers, noted only as property losses, their bodies consigned to the earth without ceremony or recognition. The quarry continued operating. New enslaved workers replaced those who had been killed or disabled, and the stone continued flowing to the construction site in Washington. The transportation of stone from Aquia Creek to Washington was itself a major logistical operation. The cut stone blocks were loaded onto boats, actually flat-bottomed barges, for transport up the Potomac River. The loading required more enslaved labor, workers straining to move blocks weighing hundreds of pounds onto the boats without benefit of modern equipment. The boats were then pulled and sailed up the river, a journey that could take several days depending on wind and current conditions. At the Washington waterfront, the stone was unloaded by more enslaved workers and hauled to the construction site. The hauling was done using ox carts on primitive roads that were barely more than muddy tracks in wet weather. Enslaved workers guided the oxen, loaded and unloaded the carts, and managed the entire logistics of keeping a steady supply of stone flowing to the masons who were laying the walls of the president's house. The actual construction of the building proceeded slowly, partly because of the scale and complexity of the work, partly because of funding problems that periodically halted construction when money ran out, partly because of the logistical challenges of keeping hundreds of workers supplied with materials at a remote site. James Hoban, the architect, served as the primary supervisor of construction, living in a house near the site and overseeing the work daily. Under Hoban were various foremen who managed different aspects of the work, masons overseeing the stonework, carpenters directing the timber framing, and so on. The enslaved workers who formed the majority of the labor force lived in temporary housing near the construction site, rough barracks or shanties that provided minimal shelter. Their living conditions were appalling even by the standards of the time. They slept on bare wooden platforms or dirt floors, with minimal bedding, no privacy, no sanitation beyond outdoor privies. They were fed a basic diet of cornmeal, salt pork, and whatever vegetables could be grown in small gardens, barely adequate nutrition for men performing heavy physical labor. The workday for enslaved construction workers began at sunrise, often earlier, and continued until sunset, often later if there was urgent work that needed to be completed. Breaks were minimal, usually just time for a midday meal. Workers who couldn't keep up the pace, who were injured or sick, were driven back to work with threats and violence. Overseers carried whips and used them freely on enslaved workers who were deemed to be slacking or disobedient. The president's house walls rose slowly, course by course of carefully laid sandstone. Each block needed to be positioned precisely, with mortar filling the joints between blocks to create a wall that would be strong and weather-tight. The masons who did this skilled work were mostly white, free craftsmen who had learned their trade through years of apprenticeship. But for every mason laying stone, multiple enslaved workers were mixing mortar, hauling blocks into position, clearing debris, doing all the supporting work that made the masons' skilled labor possible. The interior of the building required different materials and different labor. Bricks were needed for interior walls, for chimneys, for backing the stone exterior walls. The bricks were made on-site by enslaved workers, operating temporary brick kilns. The process of making bricks was simple but labor-intensive. Clay was dug from the ground, mixed with water and sand to the proper consistency, pressed into wooden molds to form individual bricks, allowed to dry, then fired in kilns heated to high temperatures by burning wood. The brick-making operation at the president's house site ran continuously during the construction seasons, producing thousands of bricks per day. Enslaved workers dug clay, prepared the mixture, molded the bricks, stacked them for drying, fed wood into the kilns, and managed every aspect of the process. The work was hot, dirty, and exhausting. Workers handling the kilns worked in temperatures that were genuinely dangerous, and injuries from burns were common. The timber for floor joists, roof trusses, interior trim, and countless other wooden components was harvested from forests in the surrounding area and processed at sawmills powered by water or animals. Much of this timber work also relied on enslaved labor. Enslaved workers felled trees, hauled logs to the mills, operated the saws under the supervision of white mill operators, and transported the finished lumber to the construction site. By 1795, 3 years into the construction, the basic structure of the president's house was taking shape. The exterior walls stood at their full height, the roof was being framed, and work had begun on the interior. But progress was slower than originally hoped, and costs were running higher than budgeted. The commissioners were constantly struggling to secure funding from Congress, which was reluctant to spend money on buildings in a capital city that still barely existed, and that many congressmen viewed as an expensive boondoggle. The financial pressures created additional hardships for the workers, particularly the enslaved laborers. When money ran short, the commissioners sometimes stopped paying the owners who had rented enslaved workers to the project. The owners, not receiving their rental payments, would pull their enslaved workers off the construction site, causing work stoppages until the financial situation was resolved. During these stoppages, enslaved workers were typically sent back to their owners' plantations to perform agricultural labor, then returned to the construction site when rental payments resumed. For the enslaved workers, these interruptions meant constant disruption, being moved back and forth between construction work and field work, never having any stability or control over their circumstances. They had no say in whether they would work on the president's house or in tobacco fields, no ability to object to the conditions they endured in either location, no recourse when they were mistreated. They were simply moved around at their owners' and the government's convenience, human property deployed wherever it was economically advantageous to use them. The work continued through the late 1790s, with enslaved workers forming the majority of the labor force throughout the entire construction period. By 1798, the exterior of the building was largely complete, and intensive work was underway on the interior spaces. The state floor rooms were being plastered, with intricate moldings and ceiling medallions created by skilled plasterers, while enslaved workers mixed and hauled the plaster, built and moved the scaffolding, and cleaned up the debris from the work. The floors throughout the building were being laid with wooden planks, some of domestic hardwoods like oak and pine, some of more expensive imported woods for the most important rooms. Enslaved workers prepared the subfloors, hauled and positioned the planking, and assisted the skilled carpenters who did the precision cutting and fitting required to create tight, level floors. The staircases were major construction projects in themselves. The grand staircase that would rise from the entrance hall to the second-floor residential quarters needed to be both structurally sound and architecturally impressive. A piece of fine carpentry that would announce the importance of the house to visitors climbing to the upper floors. Skilled carpenters crafted the treads, risers, balusters, and handrails, working with fine wood and creating joints that would be both strong and beautiful. Enslaved workers, again, did the supporting work, moving materials, holding pieces in position while they were fitted, clearing the constant debris generated by the precision carpentry. By 1800, 8 years after the cornerstone was laid, the president's house was ready for occupancy, though work on the interior would continue for several more years. The building that emerged from those 8 years of labor was genuinely impressive. One of the largest residences in the United States, a building that could hold its own architecturally with the finest houses in Europe. It was 170 feet wide, 85 feet deep, with 3 full stories plus the basement level, containing approximately 55,000 square feet of space across all floors. The exterior walls of Aquia Creek sandstone were beautiful in their natural gray-tan color, the stone's slight porosity giving it a warm, textured appearance that changed subtly in different light conditions. The north facade, facing Pennsylvania Avenue, presented a dignified, imposing face to visitors approaching from the city. The central portico, with its columns and pediment, created a formal entrance suitable for receiving foreign dignitaries. The symmetrical arrangement of windows announced order and classical proportions. The building looked permanent, serious, authoritative, exactly what the commissioners and President Washington had wanted. The interior, though still unfinished in many details, contained the spaces that would define the building's functions for the next 2 centuries. The entrance hall on the north side led directly to a cross hall that ran the width of the building. To the right, the east room waited for completion, its walls plastered, but the rooms still undecorated and unfurnished. To the left, a series of smaller reception rooms provided spaces for more intimate gatherings. At the western end, the president's office offered a workspace separate from the residential quarters above. The grand staircase rose from the entrance hall, curving gracefully to the second floor, where the president's family would live. The second floor contained bedrooms, sitting rooms, private spaces where the president could retreat from official duties. The third floor under the roof contained additional bedrooms and servants' quarters, smaller rooms with lower ceilings illuminated by dormer windows. The basement level contained the service spaces that would keep the house functioning, kitchens with large fireplaces for cooking, storage rooms for food and supplies, workrooms where servants would perform the countless tasks required to maintain a household of this size. The basement was the domain of servants, the behind-the-scenes space where the real work of running the house would happen, invisible to the important visitors using the state floor above. John Adams and his wife Abigail moved into the president's house in November 1800, becoming its first residence. They found a building that was impressive in scale, but uncomfortable in reality. The house was cold, damp, and drafty. The plastered walls hadn't fully dried, making the interior humid and unhealthy. Many rooms were still unfinished, empty shells awaiting furniture and decoration. The grounds were a muddy construction site, littered with debris from the building work and lacking any kind of landscaping. Abigail Adams wrote letters complaining about the conditions, describing the house as habitable, but far from comfortable. She famously used the unfinished east room to hang laundry because there was nowhere else to dry clothes in the enormous, mostly empty house. She found the house difficult to heat, with the large rooms requiring enormous amounts of firewood to achieve even minimal warmth in winter. She struggled to find enough servants to maintain a house of this size, as Washington was still barely a city, with few people and fewer amenities. But for all her complaints, Abigail Adams also recognized the house's symbolic importance. In one letter, she wrote that she prayed that none but honest and wise men ever rule under this roof. She understood that the building was not just a residence but a symbol, that it represented the permanence of the American experiment in Republican government. Whatever its practical shortcomings, the President's house announced that the United States intended to endure. The Adams family lived in the house for only 4 months. John Adams lost the election of 1800 to Thomas Jefferson, and in March 1801, Adams left the President's house and Thomas Jefferson moved in. Jefferson would be the first president to serve a full term in residence, and he would put his own stamp on the building through modifications and additions that reflected his architectural vision. Jefferson, who had submitted his own design in the original competition and lost to Hoban, had definite opinions about how the President's house should be arranged and used. He found the building too formal, too palace-like for a Republican leader. He made modifications to soften the formality, creating more casual spaces and designing terraces and outbuildings that would connect the main house to the surrounding grounds. Jefferson added low wings extending east and west from the main building, creating covered colonnades that provided weather-protected access to outbuildings. The east colonnade led to stables and storage buildings. The west colonnade led to a building that housed Jefferson's office and a small museum where he displayed artifacts from the Lewis and Clark expedition and his natural history collections. These colonnades were elegant architectural additions that made the building more functional while maintaining the classical aesthetic. But Jefferson's modifications also perpetuated the reliance on enslaved labor. The construction of the colonnades and outbuildings employed enslaved workers, continuing the pattern established during the original construction. And Jefferson brought enslaved people from Monticello to work as servants in the President's house, cooking his meals, maintaining his living quarters, performing all the domestic labor required to support his household. These enslaved servants lived in the basement of the President's house and in the outbuildings, occupying spaces specifically designed for servants. They were the invisible workforce that made Jefferson's comfortable residency possible. The people who cooked and cleaned and laundered and maintained, whose labor freed Jefferson to pursue his intellectual interests and political duties. They were essential to the functioning of the house, yet they were deliberately made invisible, their spaces separated from the public and ceremonial spaces above. The contradiction of Thomas Jefferson, the author of All Men Are Created Equal, living in a house built by enslaved people and bringing enslaved people to work as his servants, was noted by some observers even at the time. But Jefferson saw no contradiction, or if he did, he managed to compartmentalize it in ways that allowed him to continue enslaving hundreds of people while proclaiming his commitment to liberty. The President's house became a physical manifestation of this contradiction, a monument to freedom built and maintained by people who were denied freedom. The War of 1812 brought catastrophe to the President's house and would lead directly to its transformation into the White House we know today. In August 1814, British forces invaded Washington as part of their campaign in the Chesapeake region. President James Madison and his cabinet fled the city as British troops approached, leaving the capital essentially undefended. Dolly Madison, the president's wife, remained at the President's house until the last possible moment, gathering important documents and a famous portrait of George Washington by Gilbert Stuart before fleeing just ahead of the British arrival. When British troops entered Washington on August 24, 1814, they found the President's house abandoned. According to accounts from British officers, they first looted the house, taking whatever valuables they could find, eating a dinner that had been prepared for the Madisons before their hasty departure, drinking wine from the cellar. Then, following orders to destroy public buildings, they methodically set fire to the President's house. The British soldiers piled furniture in the center of rooms, poured gunpowder and other accelerants over everything, and lit fires throughout the building. The fire spread rapidly, consuming the wooden interior elements, the floors and staircases and roof timbers. The heat was so intense that it cracked marble mantles and shattered glass. The fire burned through the night, visible for miles, a beacon announcing the capture and humiliation of the American capital. When the British troops withdrew the next day and residents began returning to Washington, they found the president's house gutted. The sandstone exterior walls still stood, blackened by smoke and damaged by heat, but structurally sound. The interior was completely destroyed, a smoking ruin with only charred timbers and debris remaining. The roof was gone, the floors had collapsed into the basement, the beautiful plasterwork was destroyed. 8 years of construction and 14 years of use had been erased in a single night of deliberate destruction. The question facing the government was what to do with the burned-out shell. Some congressmen argued for abandoning Washington entirely, moving the capital to a different city, perhaps Philadelphia, or a new location farther from the coast, where it would be less vulnerable to British naval power. Others argued for rebuilding in Washington, but constructing a new president's house on a different site, leaving the burned building as a memorial or simply demolishing it. But President Madison and most of his administration wanted to rebuild the president's house on its original site. Abandoning the building would be an admission that the British had successfully destroyed something that couldn't be recovered. Rebuilding would demonstrate American resilience, would show that the Republic would endure despite temporary setbacks. The decision to rebuild was as much about symbolism as practicality, about sending a message that the United States would not be intimidated or driven from its capital. James Hoban, the original architect, was brought back to oversee the rebuilding. Now in his 50s, Hoban faced the task of reconstructing the building he had designed and built 25 years earlier. The sandstone walls, though damaged, were salvageable. They needed to be cleaned, repaired where the stone had been cracked by heat, and stabilized. But they could serve as the basis for rebuilding, rather than requiring complete demolition and reconstruction. The rebuilding would employ the same labor model as the original construction, a mixture of skilled free craftsmen and enslaved laborers doing the unskilled heavy work. Once again, enslaved workers were rented from their owners, brought to Washington, housed in temporary barracks, and put to work clearing debris, hauling materials, mixing mortar, supporting the skilled craftsmen who were doing the precision reconstruction work. The clearing of debris from the burned interior was itself a major task that fell primarily to enslaved laborers. The collapsed floors and roof had created enormous amounts of charred timber that needed to be removed. The debris was mixed with plaster fragments, broken glass, damaged stone, all of which needed to be cleared before reconstruction could begin. Enslaved workers hauled this debris out of the building in baskets and wheelbarrows, working in dangerous conditions among unstable ruins, breathing the dust and ash that filled the air. Once the debris was cleared, the rebuilding proceeded floor by floor, from the basement up. New floor joists were installed, supported by the original walls and by new interior partitions. New plasterwork was applied to the walls, creating smooth surfaces ready for decoration. The grand staircase was reconstructed, the state floor rooms were rebuilt and refined, the residential quarters on the second floor were restored. The rebuilding took 3 years, from 1815 to 1818. James Monroe became president in March 1817 and moved into the partially rebuilt house in the fall of that year, even though work was still ongoing on many interior spaces. Monroe and his family lived amid construction, with workers still plastering walls and installing trim, while the president conducted official business in the completed rooms. During this reconstruction, a crucial decision was made that would give the building its eventual name. The Aquia Creek sandstone walls had been badly smoke-stained by the fire, leaving dark streaks and discoloration that was both unsightly and a constant reminder of the building's destruction. To cover these stains and give the building a fresh appearance, the commissioners decided to paint the exterior walls white. The paint was a lime-based whitewash, a mixture of lime, water, and other ingredients that could be applied to stone to create a bright white coating. Whitewash served both aesthetic and practical purposes. It covered the smoke damage, making the building look new again. It also sealed the porous sandstone, providing some protection from weather and reducing water penetration that could damage the stone over time. The decision to paint the walls white transformed the building's appearance dramatically. The natural gray-tan sandstone had been elegant, but somewhat subdued. The white paint created a building that was brilliant, eye-catching, visible from a distance. The white walls made the building look larger and more imposing. They created sharp contrast with the dark windows and doors, emphasizing the building's classical proportions. The building became white in appearance, and people began calling it the White House. The name White House was informal at first, a popular nickname rather than an official designation. Officially, the building was still called the President's House or the Executive Mansion. But White House captured the public imagination and became the common term. By the 1820s, most people in Washington and across the country referred to the building as the White House, and the name stuck. There's a deeper meaning to this name that goes beyond simple description of the building's color. The whiteness was literally a coat of paint, covering smoke damage, covering the evidence of what had happened to the building. And metaphorically, the white exterior represented the beautiful surface that covered the darker realities of how the building had been constructed and who had built it. The White House was white on the outside, gleaming and perfect, while being built and maintained by black hands that remained invisible to most visitors. The rebuilding that created the White House also created opportunities for improvements to the original design. Hoban added architectural elements that made the building more imposing and refined. The south facade received a semicircular portico with a colonnade of columns, creating an elegant entrance from the grounds. This south portico, completed in 1824, provided covered access to the state floor and created the iconic curved colonnade that appears in countless photographs. The north facade received a more formal entrance portico in 1829, replacing the earlier, simpler entrance. This north portico featured a triangular pediment supported by columns, creating the formal entrance that faces Pennsylvania Avenue and serves as the primary public face of the building. The north portico transformed the building's appearance, making it look more like a classical temple and less like a large country house. These porticos, added during the post-fire reconstruction, created the White House's iconic appearance. The building as it exists today, the shape that appears on postcards and in films, and in the American visual imagination, is fundamentally the building created in the 1820s, with its white walls and columned porticos, creating a structure that announces permanence and classical dignity. Throughout the 1800s, the White House continued to evolve, with each president making modifications that reflected changing needs and personal preferences. Andrew Jackson, the seventh president, added running water to the White House in 1833, installing pipes that brought water from a spring into the house. This was a major improvement to the building's functionality, eliminating the need for servants to haul water from wells or cisterns. Enslaved and free black servants had been responsible for this water hauling, carrying buckets up and down stairs dozens of times daily to supply the household's needs. The running water reduced this labor burden, though it didn't eliminate it, as many areas of the house still lacked direct water access. James Polk added gas lighting in 1848, replacing the candles and oil lamps that had illuminated the house previously. Gas lighting was a modern convenience that made the house safer and more comfortable, but it required infrastructure, gas lines running through the walls, fixtures installed in every room, a gas plant constructed on the grounds to generate the gas. This infrastructure work again employed both free and enslaved labor, continuing the pattern established during the original construction. The question of slavery in the White House became increasingly fraught as the 1800s progressed and the national debate over slavery intensified. Every president, through Lincoln, either owned enslaved people or was comfortable with slavery's existence, and most brought enslaved servants to work in the White House during their terms. These enslaved servants lived in the basement and outbuildings, worked in the kitchens and laundries, cleaned the state floor rooms, maintained the gardens, performed every menial task required to keep the house functioning. For the enslaved servants working in the White House, the experience was complex and contradictory. On one hand, working in the president's house was generally considered less harsh than field labor on a plantation. The work was indoors, the living conditions were somewhat better, the food was more adequate. Some enslaved White House servants had opportunities to learn skills or make connections that might eventually lead to freedom or better circumstances. On the other hand, working in the White House meant being constantly on display, always under scrutiny, never able to relax or let down the mask of subservience that survival required. It meant serving dinners at which politicians and diplomats discussed liberty and natural rights, while being unable to claim those rights for yourself. It meant maintaining a building that symbolized freedom while being denied freedom. The psychological cost of this contradiction was severe, creating a constant cognitive dissonance that some enslaved servants described in later accounts as worse than physical hardship. The White House also became a site where enslaved people were sometimes bought and sold, or where deals related to slavery were made. Presidents who owned enslaved people would sometimes bring them to the White House, work them as servants for a period, then send them back to plantations or sell them when circumstances changed. The building that symbolized American democracy to the world was, behind closed doors, a site where human beings were treated as property and traded like livestock. Paul Jennings, an enslaved man who worked in the White House as James Madison's personal servant, left one of the few first-hand accounts we have of enslaved life in the president's house. Jennings was later purchased from Dolly Madison by Senator Daniel Webster, who allowed him to work as a free man to pay off the purchase price, effectively enabling him to buy his own freedom. After gaining his freedom, Jennings wrote a memoir describing his years in the White House, providing rare insight into the experience of enslaved servants in the building. Jennings described the constant work, the long hours, the expectation that enslaved servants would be available whenever needed, regardless of personal needs or desires. He described the fear of being sold away from family, the knowledge that his circumstances could change instantly at his owner's whim. He also described moments of kindness from Dolly Madison and others, small gestures that made the bondage slightly more bearable but didn't change its fundamental nature. His account reveals the complex humanity of the situation, the ways that enslaved people maintained dignity and formed relationships and built lives within the constraints of slavery, while never forgetting or accepting that they were enslaved. The Civil War brought the question of slavery to a crisis point, and the White House was at the center of the political struggle. Abraham Lincoln moved into the White House in March 1861 as president of a fracturing nation. By the time of his inauguration, 7 southern states had already seceded, and Fort Sumter would be fired upon just weeks later, beginning the war. Lincoln's White House was a building under siege, both literally and figuratively. Washington, D.C. was surrounded by slave states, Maryland and Virginia, and there was genuine fear that Confederate forces would capture the capital. The city was fortified, troops were stationed throughout Washington, and the White House itself became a kind of military headquarters where Lincoln coordinated the war effort. Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation in the White House on January 1, 1863, using executive power to declare that enslaved people in rebellious states were now free. The document was signed in the president's office on the 2nd floor, in a room that had been built by enslaved labor, in a building that had been constructed and maintained by enslaved people throughout its entire existence. The contradiction was profound, the culmination of 70 years of American history, playing out in a building that embodied all of America's contradictions about slavery and freedom. The Emancipation Proclamation didn't immediately free any enslaved people. Its legal effect was limited to areas in rebellion where the federal government had no power to enforce it, but its symbolic importance was enormous. It transformed the war from a conflict about preserving the Union into a war about ending slavery. It announced that the federal government, represented by the president working from the White House, was now committed to slavery's destruction. After the Civil War, after the 13th Amendment legally ended slavery throughout the United States, the White House's relationship to race shifted, but didn't fundamentally change. The building no longer housed enslaved servants, but it continued to employ servants who were disproportionately black, working in positions that were poorly paid and offered little opportunity for advancement. The racial hierarchy that slavery had enforced legally now continued through economic and social structures that kept black workers in subordinate positions. The physical structure of the White House continued evolving through the late 1800s and into the 1900s. Benjamin Harrison installed electric lighting in 1891, though the Harrison family was reportedly afraid of the new technology and often had servants turn the lights on and off rather than touching the switches themselves. This early electric system was primitive and somewhat dangerous, with exposed wiring and fixtures that occasionally sparked or gave shocks. Theodore Roosevelt undertook a major expansion of the White House in 1902, driven by both practical and symbolic considerations. The Roosevelt family was large, with 6 children, and the second-floor residential quarters were cramped and inadequate. Additionally, the growth of the federal government and the increasing complexity of the presidency meant that the president needed more office space, more room for staff, more facilities for conducting official business. Roosevelt hired the architectural firm McKim, Mead & White, one of the most prestigious firms in America, to design and oversee the renovation. The renovation was extensive, essentially creating a new building while maintaining the historic exterior. The most significant change was the construction of the West Wing, a new building attached to the main White House that would house the president's office and staff workspace, separating the official business functions from the residential quarters. The West Wing construction was completed rapidly, finished in just a few months in late 1902. The new building provided office space for the president and his immediate staff, as well as a cabinet room where the president could meet with his cabinet secretaries. The West Wing freed up space in the main White House, allowing the entire second floor to be devoted to residential use rather than having to accommodate both family living and presidential offices. The renovation also modified the state floor, restoring some rooms to what McKim, Mead & White imagined as their original 1800s appearance, removing Victorian-era additions that were considered garish and out of keeping with the building's classical dignity. The East Room was redecorated in a simpler, more elegant style. The state dining room was expanded, allowing it to accommodate larger dinners. The entrance hall and cross hall were refined, creating more impressive spaces for receiving visitors. William Howard Taft, Roosevelt's successor, expanded the West Wing significantly in 1909, doubling its size and creating the Oval Office as the president's ceremonial office. The Oval Office was designed to echo the shape of the Blue Room in the main White House, creating a uniquely shaped space that would become iconic. The oval shape was both aesthetically distinctive and practically useful, allowing the president to arrange furniture in ways that would be difficult in a rectangular room. By the early 1900s, the White House had grown into a complex of buildings rather than a single structure. The main White House contained the residential quarters and the state floor ceremonial spaces. The West Wing housed the president's office and staff. The East Wing, constructed later, provided additional staff workspace and served as the entrance for visitors to public tours. Connecting these buildings were colonnades and underground passages, creating a unified complex that functioned as both home and headquarters. But despite all these renovations and additions, despite the installation of modern conveniences like electricity and telephones, and eventually air conditioning, the basic structure of the building remained the sandstone walls built in the 1790s by enslaved workers. Every modification, every modernization, was built onto or into that original structure. The White House's foundation, literal and metaphorical, was the work of enslaved people, and no amount of renovation could change that fundamental fact. By the late 1940s, the White House was in serious physical trouble. Nearly 150 years of use, multiple renovations that had weakened structural elements, and the sheer age of the building had created a structure that was actually dangerous to occupy. The wooden floor joists and beams that had been installed during the post-1814 reconstruction were deteriorating, weakened by age and stress. The building was settling unevenly, causing cracks in walls and ceilings. Most alarmingly, engineers discovered that some interior walls were carrying far more weight than they had been designed to support, creating a real risk of collapse. The crisis point came during Harry Truman's presidency. In 1948, during a reception, a leg of Margaret Truman's piano broke through the second-floor flooring, creating a hole in the ceiling of the room below. This incident prompted a thorough engineering investigation that revealed the extent of the problems. The building, engineers concluded, was structurally unsound and could collapse if not completely rebuilt internally. Truman ordered a complete gutting and reconstruction of the White House interior, one of the most ambitious preservation projects ever undertaken on a historic building. From 1949 to 1952, while the Truman family lived across the street in Blair House, the White House was reduced to its exterior walls. Everything inside the building was demolished and removed. The floors, the grand staircase, the partition walls, all the interior elements that made up the rooms and spaces were torn out and hauled away, leaving only the outer shell. The demolition was documented extensively with photographs that show the White House reduced to a hollow box. The exterior walls standing without any interior structure, workers moving through empty space where rooms had been. The photographs are haunting, showing the building stripped of everything that made it functional, reduced to its most basic elements. The reconstruction involved building essentially a new structure inside the old walls. Modern steel and concrete replaced the wooden beams and joists that had supported the building for 150 years. New foundations were poured to stabilize the structure. Modern mechanical systems, heating, air conditioning, plumbing, electrical, were installed throughout. The rooms were rebuilt to their previous configurations, but using modern materials and construction techniques that would ensure the building's stability for another century. The Truman reconstruction raises a profound philosophical question. Is the White House still the same building that was constructed in the 1790s? The exterior walls are largely original, though sections have been repaired and replaced over the years. But the interior is entirely from the 1950s, built with modern materials, using modern techniques. Is a building defined by its exterior shell or by its interior spaces and the structural elements that support them? There's no definitive answer to this question, and historians and preservationists debate it still. But perhaps the question itself reveals something important about the White House. The building is both ancient and modern, both original and replica, both authentic historical structure and carefully maintained reproduction. What makes the White House isn't really the physical fabric of stone and steel. It's the accumulated history, the fact that every president has lived and worked there, the decisions that have been made within its walls, the symbolic weight it carries in American and world consciousness. The White House that emerged from the Truman reconstruction was structurally modern, but appeared historically accurate. The state floor rooms were rebuilt to look as they had looked in previous eras, with period furniture and decorations creating spaces that seemed unchanged by time. Visitors touring the White House would have no idea, unless told, that they were walking through rooms built in the 1950s rather than the 1790s or 1810s. This careful maintenance of historical appearance, while thoroughly modernizing the infrastructure, is characteristic of how the White House has been managed since the Truman reconstruction. Subsequent renovations have continued updating systems and making necessary repairs while preserving the historical appearance of the building. When the air conditioning system needs to be replaced, the work is done in ways that don't visibly alter the historic rooms. When the roof needs repair, it's done using materials that match the historical appearance. The goal is to keep the building functioning as a modern residence and workplace while maintaining its appearance as a historic structure. The White House today is an 18-acre complex containing the main White House, the West Wing, the East Wing, and various support buildings, all protected by extensive security systems that have been progressively expanded since the 1960s. The entire complex is surrounded by fencing and barriers that create a security perimeter extending well beyond the buildings themselves. The public cannot approach close to the White House anymore. cannot stand at the fence and look in the windows, as was possible for much of the building's history. The main White House contains 132 rooms across 6 levels: the basement, the ground floor, the state floor, the second floor residential quarters, the third floor, and a sub-basement level that contains modern mechanical systems. The rooms include 35 bathrooms, 412 doors, 147 windows, 28 fireplaces, 8 staircases, and 3 elevators. The building contains approximately 55,000 square feet of floor space, making it comparable in size to a large mansion, but small compared to the palaces of European monarchs. The state floor, the primary floor for public and ceremonial use, contains the rooms that appear in news coverage and official photographs. The East Room is the largest room in the White House, approximately 80 feet by 37 feet, used for large receptions, press conferences, and entertainment events. The room contains 3 large chandeliers, a portrait of George Washington, and usually minimal furniture since its function is to accommodate large numbers of standing guests. West of the East Room is the Green Room, a small parlor decorated in green fabrics and used for small receptions and as a sitting room. The Blue Room is oval-shaped, matching the shape of the Oval Office in the West Wing, and is the formal reception room where the President receives guests during official functions. The Red Room is another small parlor, decorated in red tones, used for small receptions, and as a sitting room for the First Lady. The State Dining Room occupies the western end of the State floor and can accommodate 140 dinner guests when fully set. The room contains a portrait of Abraham Lincoln and is decorated with classical moldings and a dramatic chandelier. State dinners held in this room are major diplomatic events, carefully choreographed occasions where the President entertains foreign leaders and other important guests. The second-floor residential quarters are private and are rarely photographed or shown to the public. This floor contains the President's bedroom and the First Lady's bedroom, which may be separate rooms or a shared suite depending on the preference of the current occupants. Additional bedrooms accommodate family members and overnight guests. The floor includes sitting rooms, studies, and private spaces where the President's family can live with some degree of privacy, away from the constant public scrutiny that surrounds the presidency. The third floor contains additional bedrooms and a large room that has been used variously as a game room, a music room, and a recreation space. This floor is less formally decorated than the floors below and serves primarily as private space for the presidential family. The ground floor, partially below grade, contains various offices, the White House kitchen, storage rooms, and spaces for staff. The kitchen is large and commercial in scale, capable of preparing meals for hundreds of guests when necessary. Multiple cooks and kitchen staff work here, preparing everything from family meals for the President to elaborate state dinners. The basement and sub-basement contain the mechanical systems that keep the White House functioning: heating and air conditioning equipment, electrical systems, water and sewage systems, communications equipment, security systems. These levels also contain the underground tunnels that connect different parts of the White House complex and provide secure routes for moving people and materials without exposure to public view. The West Wing, connected to the main White House by a colonnade, contains the President's working office, the Oval Office, and workspace for senior White House staff. The Oval Office is approximately 35 feet by 29 feet, with 3 large south-facing windows and 2 doors, one leading to a private study and one to the Rose Garden. The President can configure the office's furniture and decoration according to personal preference, and each President makes changes that reflect their style and priorities. The Cabinet Room, adjacent to the Oval Office, contains a large table where the President meets with cabinet secretaries. The room's windows overlook the Rose Garden, and the room is decorated with portraits of previous presidents. The Roosevelt Room, also in the West Wing, serves as a conference room for meetings that don't require the formality of the Cabinet Room. The West Wing also contains offices for the Chief of Staff, the National Security Advisor, the Press Secretary, and other senior staff who need to be physically close to the President. The workspace is cramped, with senior officials occupying relatively small offices that would seem modest in a corporate setting. The prestige comes not from office size but from proximity to the Oval Office and the President. The grounds of the White House include the South Lawn, a large open space that serves as the setting for state arrival ceremonies, where the President's helicopter lands and takes off, and where various events are held throughout the year. The Rose Garden, west of the Oval Office, is used for press conferences, ceremony announcements, and small outdoor events. The Jacqueline Kennedy Garden, on the east side, provides another outdoor space for events and gatherings. The grounds also contain various support buildings, a maintenance facility, a greenhouse where flowers are grown for decorating the White House, and facilities for the Secret Service agents who protect the President and the complex. The entire 18-acre complex is meticulously maintained by a large staff of groundskeepers, gardeners, and maintenance workers who keep the buildings and grounds in perfect condition. The White House staff, the people who actually make the building function day to day, numbers over 400 people when you count everyone involved in maintaining, protecting, and operating the complex. This includes the resident staff who work in the main White House, cleaning, cooking, maintaining, and managing the household. The resident staff is managed by the chief usher, who oversees everyone from housekeepers to curators to the staff who maintain the gardens. The racial demographics of the White House staff have evolved over the decades, but patterns established in the 1800s remain visible. The resident staff, particularly those in less visible positions, continues to be disproportionately people of color. Housekeepers, kitchen staff, maintenance workers, the people doing the daily physical labor that keeps the White House functioning, are more likely to be Black or Hispanic than white. Meanwhile, senior staff positions, the political appointees who work in the West Wing making policy and advising the President, are disproportionately white. This division isn't accidental or coincidental. It reflects the same racial hierarchies that have characterized American society throughout its history. The same hierarchies that were encoded into the structure of the White House when it was built by enslaved people. The building's physical structure still reflects these hierarchies. The grand state floor rooms where important people gather are beautiful, spacious, designed to impress. The basement and ground floor where servants work are utilitarian, cramped, designed for function rather than appearance. The architecture literally embeds inequality, creating different spaces for different classes of people. The White House's annual operating budget exceeds $350 million, covering everything from staff salaries to security to maintenance to the costs of hosting state dinners and other official events. This is separate from the President's salary of $400,000, which is a tiny fraction of the actual cost of supporting the presidency. The President lives rent-free in a building worth hundreds of millions of dollars, has a staff of hundreds working to support them, has access to resources and facilities beyond what almost any private citizen could afford. Every aspect of presidential life in the White House is carefully managed and controlled. What the President eats is prepared by White House chefs using ingredients that have been carefully sourced and screened. Where the President goes is determined by security requirements and scheduling managed by staff. When the President appears in public, every detail has been planned and rehearsed. The President lives in a bubble, surrounded by staff and security, isolated from normal human interaction in ways that are psychologically demanding and sometimes damaging. Former presidents and presidential staff often describe the White House as simultaneously the most powerful place on earth and a kind of prison. You can theoretically do anything from the White House, command military forces, sign legislation, reshape domestic and foreign policy. But you're also trapped there, unable to move freely, unable to have private conversations or unscheduled moments, constantly performing the role of president with hundreds of people watching and documenting everything you do. The building itself shapes the presidency in subtle ways that are rarely discussed. The physical separation between the residential quarters and the working spaces in the West Wing means that presidents can never fully leave work. They live at the office in the most literal sense possible. The historic weight of the building, the knowledge that Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation here, that FDR managed World War II from here, that Kennedy confronted the Cuban Missile Crisis here, creates pressure to live up to history's judgment. The White House today is occupied by Donald Trump, serving his second non-consecutive term as president, the first president since Grover Cleveland in the 1890s to accomplish this feat. Trump's relationship with the White House and what it represents is complicated and reveals ongoing tensions in American political culture. But his occupancy of the building is ultimately a detail in the much longer story of what the White House is and what it represents. What matters more than any individual president is the building itself, its history, what it reveals about American power and American contradictions. The White House stands today, much as it has stood for over 2 centuries, white walls gleaming, classical columns projecting permanence and dignity, flag flying above, symbol of American democracy recognized around the world. But underneath that white paint, underneath the beautiful facade, underneath all the renovations and modernizations, the building remains what it has always been. A monument built by enslaved people. A palace constructed for a nation that claimed to reject monarchy. A symbol of freedom created by people who were denied freedom. A structure that embeds and perpetuates the racial hierarchies that have characterized American society from its founding. And here's the fact I promised you at the beginning. The detail that will haunt you every time you see a photograph of the White House. In 2016, after Michelle Obama mentioned in a speech that she woke up every day in a house built by slaves, some people began calling for a memorial on the White House grounds to acknowledge and honor the enslaved workers who built the president's house. The idea was to create some kind of permanent recognition, a plaque or monument that would tell visitors the truth about how the building was constructed. The idea went nowhere. No memorial was built. No plaque was installed. The White House continues today, as it has for over 200 years, to present itself as a symbol of American freedom and democracy, without any acknowledgement, anywhere on its grounds or in the building itself, of the enslaved people who built it. Their names are unknown. Their graves are unmarked. Their labor is uncompensated. Their contribution is unrecognized. They built one of the most famous buildings in the world, and they have been erased so completely from its history that most visitors have no idea they existed. That erasure is not accidental. It's deliberate. It's part of how American power works, by creating beautiful symbols that obscure ugly realities, by building monuments to freedom on foundations of slavery, by telling stories about democracy and equality, while perpetuating systems that concentrate power and wealth in the hands of a small elite at everyone else's expense. The White House will continue standing long after every person alive today is dead. It will continue serving as the residence for presidents, continue functioning as the headquarters of American executive power, continue appearing in photographs and films and news broadcasts as the ultimate symbol of American government. The building is more durable than any individual, more permanent than any political movement. But the truth about how it was built, about whose labor created it, about what it actually represents, that truth remains buried under layers of white paint and official history, and carefully curated tours that show visitors the beautiful rooms while never mentioning the enslaved people who built them. The White House is a lie, a beautiful architectural lie that America tells itself about its past and its present, and every president who has lived there, from John Adams to Donald Trump, every president who has worked in those offices and slept in those bedrooms and walked through those halls, has participated in that lie. Every time a president speaks about American values from the White House, every time they invoke freedom and democracy and equality from those rooms built by enslaved people, they perpetuate the lie that America is what it claims to be, rather than what it has always been. The enslaved workers who built the White House understood this truth. They knew that the beautiful rhetoric about liberty and natural rights was just rhetoric, that power and exploitation were the actual foundations of American society, that the building they were constructing would house people who spoke eloquently about freedom while denying freedom to millions. They built it anyway because they had no choice, because they were enslaved and their labor was not theirs to withhold. And then they died, mostly in unmarked graves, their names forgotten, their labor unacknowledged, disappeared from history as if they had never existed. But they did exist. They were real human beings with names and families and lives that mattered, even though history chose not to record them. They quarried stone and mixed mortar and laid bricks and hauled materials and built a structure that has lasted for over 2 centuries. Their hands shaped every stone in the White House's walls. Their labor created the building that symbolizes American power to the entire world. And they deserve to be remembered, to be honored, to be acknowledged for what they created and what was stolen from them. The White House stands as a monument to their exploitation, to the theft of their labor, to the system that treated them as property rather than as human beings. Until America acknowledges that truth, until there is a memorial on the White House grounds that tells visitors who really built this building, until the official history stops erasing the enslaved workers who made the White House possible, the building will continue to be a lie, a beautiful white lie, gleaming in the sun, hiding the blood and pain and stolen labor that made it possible. That's the true story of the White House, the story that the white paint covers, the story that official histories avoid, the story that every American needs to understand. Because until we confront the truth about our most sacred symbols, until we acknowledge the exploitation and violence that built this nation's most important institutions, we can never move past them. The White House will always be a monument to American contradictions, to our simultaneous commitment to freedom and our perpetuation of slavery, to our beautiful rhetoric and our ugly reality. And that monument stands today in 2025, exactly as it has stood for over 200 years, white and gleaming and lying about what it really is and how it came to be.